Is that right? She's
No,
doing
she's
it.
just gonna, yeah, is that true? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not going on
No.
to Zoom. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not meeting you guys.
We're gonna do it easy on.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Janet Webster Jones at Source Booksellers in Midtown Detroit. We are a nonfiction bookstore residing in this particular neighborhood for over 20 years now, but been in business for 33 years. Today we're going to have a new kind of interview with an illustrious Detroiter who has made so many contributions to the city of Detroit with his knowledge as a public historian. I think that's what you say yourself. And yes, and we really appreciate it because Jamon Jordan is just full of information. He has studied and looked and watched and dug and found so much about Detroit, its history, and its life over a long period of time. So Jamon, welcome to Source Booksellers.
Thank you.
We are really pleased to have you here today.
And I'm happy to be here.
Good. And he's here today because we want to talk about Juneteenth. Juneteenth has become a national holiday, and when that happened, I said, goody, goody, goody. But we want to also talk about the connection with Juneteenth and the activities that were going on in Detroit and in Windsor to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. So, Jamon, let me just ask you, tell us what you would say to people about Juneteenth, and then we'll talk about Detroit and Windsor.
So Juneteenth is the most well-known, the most celebrated emancipation celebration in the country, in the United States. And of course, it's a celebration of the end of slavery, the end of chattel slavery. And there are numerous emancipation celebrations. Just Juneteenth has emerged as the most popular one. And there's some significant reasons why it's the most popular one. And hopefully we'll get into some of the reasons why, but it is one of many other emancipation celebrations that are celebrated in the country. It has now become a federal holiday.
Yes.
And so it is the first of the emancipation celebrations that has attained federal holiday status.
Which is really quite a feat, I would say.
Yes.
We sell the book Juneteenth here at the store. This book was written by Annette Gordon-Reed,
Yes.
who is a wonderful historian and knowledge person, particularly about the Jefferson Hemings families in Virginia. But she's a Texan.
That's right. That's right.
And she knows about Juneteenth
Yes, she
as a
does.
person growing up. And then she created this little book just, I think it was just last year, to really bring into our consciousness 2021, the fact of Juneteenth in Texas, her experience and how she celebrated it when she was there, but also the history of Juneteenth.
That's right.
So I'm so glad to hear you say that there's celebrations all over the country.
That's right.
And would you say that they were in places where Black people were more dense, or were there other places where that might not have been as much density, but still celebrations?
Yeah, that's right. So in both are true. There are celebrations in places where the African American community was not as a dense and large population, like Vermont, for instance. And then there are other places where the African American population, their numbers, their influence, their political relationships allowed them to create celebrations honoring their freedom, like Washington, D.C. And so all of these exist, and then everything in between, there's all of these celebrations. Some have fallen by the wayside. They used to be important and significant in an area or a city or a town, but no longer do people celebrate that. The later generations stopped celebrating them, and so the celebration kind of died off. But historically, there were numerous emancipation celebrations. For instance, in Vermont, which became a state with its first constitution outlawing slavery, it is the first of the former 13 colonies that will that will, in its original constitution, will outlaw slavery. All of the 13 colonies had slavery. We think of slavery as a Southern phenomenon, but every one of the 13 colonies had slavery. Massachusetts had slavery. New York had slavery. Delaware had slavery. Rhode Island had slavery. And Vermont did. But Vermont ended slavery when it became a state. That issue of ending slavery to become a state was one of the factors of preventing Vermont from being entered into the Union for another decade.
Wow.
So they put this anti-slavery clause inside of their state constitution, and they were not admitted into the Union for another 10 years after that. So in 1777, they outlawed slavery. They won't be a part of the United States until 1787.
Wow.
And so that was a celebration. There was a celebration on the founding of Vermont. They had a freedom celebration that used to exist. It used to be celebrated in Vermont. The last I've heard is that celebration no longer exists in Vermont. So there are places like that, and events like that in Boston and in New York, and they have these other emancipation celebrations that are related to when those states ended slavery. And some of them have fallen by the wayside. People don't celebrate those. They celebrate Juneteenth. Juneteenth has become the catch-all emancipation celebration because of its popularity. There's important reasons why Juneteenth is more popular than the other ones.
It's so good to hear this kind of history, because when we just say Juneteenth, people can go anywhere.
Yeah.
But when we have the information, like I had no idea about Vermont, and that's why we wanted so much for you to be here and to share with us that we're going to be able to play on our YouTube channel so a lot of people can hear it. And that's what I mean by what I feel is a public historian, because you're bringing us information that's so good. Let's skip on to Detroit.
Yes. So Detroit has had a number of emancipation celebrations. So let's start with January 6th, 1863. So we know that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863. And so many emancipation celebrations are around or on January 1st. January 1st has evolved into, or the night, New Year's Eve turning into New Year's has evolved throughout the Black communities throughout the country as Watch Night. And many churches have a Watch Night service. And it's directly related to the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Lincoln gave a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, basically warning the Southern states, hey, if you do not come back to the Union by January 1, 1863, then I'm going to sign an Emancipation Proclamation outlawing slavery in all states and areas that are still in rebellion. And so none of those rebelling states come back from this warning that Lincoln issues in September of 1862. So there are people waiting to see, is he going to sign it on January 1st, 1863? Will Black people become free? And so that celebration is really not a celebration. It is a commemoration and an honoring of that history that is called Watch Night. And they have Watch Night services.
I had known of Watch Night, but I thought it was some kind of religious holiday.
Because it is Black churches that established it, but it's directly related to the Emancipation Proclamation. So in Detroit, after Watch Night, January 1st, a few days later, they celebrate the fact that he did sign it, and there seems to be people who are finally becoming free. Because as the Union is going into Southern territories, now Black people who they're either freed by those Union soldiers or they run away to Union lines. That is how Black people became free. So let's be clear. Signing a piece of paper didn't free anybody, because he's fighting the South. They're having a war. They're not listening to Lincoln. They don't, when he signs the name of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Confederate soldiers don't leave the battlefield, go back home to their plantation and say, you know what, the guy we're fighting, we're fighting his soldiers from the North. He said you're free, so now you're going to go free. I mean, now what has to happen now is there has to be bloodshed. Union soldiers have to go into areas where people are enslaved and either free those Africans who are enslaved in those areas, or those black people have to run away to Union lines. Within the first 6 months of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, 500,000 Africans escaped from slavery, running to Union lines. Prior to this, Lincoln had been sending people back into slavery. So black people aren't dumb. They were enslaved by the Southern slave owners. They realized, okay, the Southern slave owners, they're the Confederates. And this other army is fighting the South. They must be our friends. So they run away to Union lines. In 1861 and 1862, they're running away. And Lincoln does not want the war to tilt on slavery. He's trying to get around the issue of slavery for the first 2 years of the war. And so he's having his commanders send these black people who escaped from slavery back. Eventually, some commanders, some generals say, "To heck with this. This is not working because we're fighting against the South. These enslaved Africans who are in the South are creating the products that the Southerners are selling to make money to continue this war." So these Union commanders aren't all abolitionists, but they see that slavery is detrimental to winning the war for the North. And so they come up with a contraband policy where if these black people escape, they're going to treat them as contraband. That's kind of the middle of the road policy. They do this without Lincoln's permission first. Eventually Lincoln signs on to agree that this will be the policy. But at first, they're doing this on their own. They're saying, we're not sending them back. They'll work for us now.
So when did they become soldiers? When did the Negro?
Right. So when Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, which now states that any black person, any enslaved person in a territory that's still, state or territory, that's still in rebellion. So that means the northern states, the border states, and the states that have already been occupied by the Union, they're not free. Black people, doesn't apply to them. It only applies to the states that are still in rebellion. So now, he also adds on to that Emancipation Proclamation, probably something that's as important, if not more important, than the first part. And that is, once free, they can join the Union Army. Almost 200,000 black people joined the Union Army. Some of whom are living in Canada. They've escaped from slavery on the Underground Railroad. They're living free in Canada. They come back to America to join this war because for them, the war is not about what Lincoln's been fighting. Lincoln's been fighting a war to bring the country back together. These black people don't care nothing about Mississippi coming back to the United States. That is not why they fight. They're fighting because they believe this is a freedom war. They're fighting for what they believe in. And they believe that after fighting in this war, there's no way slavery can be reinstituted. And so they're fighting also to get back at the people who sold their mother away from them, who broke up their families. Now you're going to give me a weapon to go deal with the people who did this to us? They're basically seeing this is a slave rebellion if we had a whole army. This is Nat Turner's rebellion if we had a Union army backing Nat Turner. That's how they see the war. And they changed the course of the war because they're not drafted. Lincoln has instituted a draft, or he's pushed the states to institute a draft. So every state in the North has instituted a draft. So you don't have to have a federal draft because every state has created a draft. The South has done the same thing. They're drafting. They're not drafting black people in the South, and they're not drafting black people in the North. But 200,000 black people volunteered in the Civil War. That changes the course of the war. Let's say they just joined and didn't fight hard and weren't great warriors. Let's say that was the case. That's not the case, but let's say that was the case. The fact that they joined helped northern states meet their military draft quotas. So that means that less whites had to go fight because 200,000 African Americans joined. That kept some northern states from seceding with the South. Because there were some northern states who were threatening to leave the Union and join the South because they did not want their youth, their young men to go die in this war, especially once it starts turning to a war to free black people. But that kept a lot of northern states in the war, or kept them on the Union side, at least not fighting against Lincoln. It's very important to understand African Americans' position and their participation in the Civil War, and that they're freeing themselves after the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. They're running away to Union lines. They don't have Facebook. Nobody texted them and said, "Hey, you're free now if you run away." But they found out. Everything white people know, African Americans know. So they're in the houses, they're on the plantations, they're even on the Confederate fields. They're not soldiers, but they're cleaning the clothes of the Confederate soldiers. They're cooking the food for the Confederate soldiers. They're carrying the water. They're building bridges and trenches for the Confederate soldiers. So they're there too. So everywhere that stuff is happening, black people know about it. And so that brings us to Juneteenth. June 19, 1865. How is it that over 2 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, there are black people still enslaved in Texas? The normal story is they were the last to find out. And that is a myth. Black people knew that they were free. What has happened is two things has happened. In most of Texas, particularly southern Texas, there has been very little Union activity. The Union Army has not been there. Again, you can only get free if the Union Army shows up. The Confederates aren't listening to Lincoln. They're not freeing anyone. You have to escape. So that's one thing. You're further away from Union lines. If you do escape, you're more likely to be captured by slave catchers, bounty hunters, and patrollers before you ever make it to a Union line if you're coming from Texas, particularly Galveston, Texas. So that's one issue. The other issue is slave owners in Louisiana and Alabama run away to Texas. So they're taking black people who they know would have escaped. Slave owners are taking Africans through their enslaving to Texas to continue living a Confederate life in Texas, hoping and wishing that the Union Army would never show up there. You know, they're never going to go that deep into the South. And so they continue living their Southern life in Texas. And these black people know they just are so far away from Union lines, they can't get free. All right? So it is a myth that they were the last to know. They knew. Anything white folks knew, they knew. That's right. All right? And so they knew, but they could not easily get free. It needed to be a battle. Eventually, there is a skirmish down in Texas when General Gordon Granger and a number of other soldiers, in fact, some colored regiments are a part of this fight, go into Texas and have some skirmishes, basically show up armed and tell the Confederates there, you're not going to win this. You need to give up. And these black people are free. That's kind of what happens. It isn't they just show up and inform black people that they're free. They come in with guns and let the Confederates who have been holding them for the last 2 years know that if you don't free them, then the war continues, at least for you. And so they're forced to accept the freedom of these black people who knew they were free for that 2 years. They weren't the last to know. They were the last to be able, or among the last, to find out that there will be an army showing up to help them, to back them up. That's right.
Yes, very good. Wow, this is great. I love the information. I love the understanding. We so much need to know the details.
Right.
And Jamon Jordan has truly given those. I have a book here called The Black West, and one of the things that we're doing here at Source Booksellers is to focus on Texas. And we're having a book on the Black Rodeo that's going to be in Dallas, I think it is, this Juneteenth weekend. I would love to get our black horse riders.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
To come down the
They're
street.
going to be in Fort Worth.
Oh, they're in Fort Worth, so they can't come. Maybe we'll get them another time. Just come down the street. And this book that we have for this weekend coming up, the Juneteenth weekend, is about the Black West.
That's right.
And Annette Gordon Reed in her book often says that the only thing that we think about the West are cowboys, but there is a Black West, and there are people that have been on the horses, and
That's right.
makes me think about the Buffalo Soldiers,
That's
which
right.
is a whole nother part.
Whole nother part,
To talk about, which I don't know we can get to today, but that's another thing. Then on Sunday here at Source Booksellers, we're going to talk about black food. And so this book is a cookbook for Juneteenth. This is a new book. It has not been out before. The Juneteenth cookbook of Black celebrations called Watermelon and Redbirds. So we're really making an effort to have a lot of Juneteenth information, but we really wanted you to talk about Juneteenth in the way you've been talking. And then I guess to finish up, we can talk a little bit more about Detroit.
Yes.
And
Emancipation Day.
Emancipation Day.
Right.
And I remember that.
Right.
I think that we may have gone a few times. We didn't go a lot, but then after it stopped, we always went over to the park anyway.
That's right.
Windsor.
So earlier I talked about the fact that January 6th was that first emancipation celebration in the city of Detroit at Second Baptist Church. And it was, of course, celebrating the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation.
And the night watch, I just
Yep.
love that.
But before that, in 1831 through 1832, there is a slave rebellion in Jamaica. And there has been a long-lasting and pretty influential abolitionist movement in England, in Great Britain. And this slave rebellion in Jamaica, the level of brutality that happened, the Africans who are killing their slave owners, but also the whites who are killing the Africans who are leading the revolt. The brutality, which is published by the abolitionists in England, helps to bring the Parliament, the British Parliament, into ending slavery in the British Empire. And so in 1833, in June of 1833, after the slave rebellion in Jamaica, so just understand that every time there's this proclamation of freedom, wherever it is, whether it's England, whether it's the United States, there's these black people who have done some stuff that help bring that about. Right, and so England the British Empire will end slavery throughout the empire. Now there have been some gradual things that have already happened. So there's been a act to abolish slavery in Canada in 1793. And what it did is it ended bringing new Africans over. And slavery, if you already live in Canada and you're already enslaved, you're still enslaved. But anyone born after 1793 can only be enslaved till they're 25 years old. And then Britain outlawed the slave trade totally in 1807. So no more of any part of no British people. So in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Trinidad, it's illegal now, if they're British, to be involved in the slave trade, going to Africa, getting people, putting them on slave ships and bringing them to the New World. That's illegal after 1807. And then the slave revolt in Jamaica brings them to the final result, which is the abolition of slavery, June of 1833. It goes into effect in 1834. Okay. They signed it in 1833 with an effect date of the following year.
So that must have been quite a celebration.
So that became the Emancipation Day celebration that is celebrated for our region. Canada was the main place where this was celebrated, and it was a big celebration. It rivaled Juneteenth, all right? And what Juneteenth was doing in America, growing throughout America, Emancipation Day was doing the same in Canada and in the border states of Canada, like Detroit or Michigan, like New York, like Maine. So those states that border Canada were also celebrating, they were having these emancipation celebrations. Minnesota, Nova Scotia. So they were having celebrations because many people were from both sides. You had people who live in Michigan who have family over in Canada. In Maine, you got people in Maine who have family over in Canada. So this interrelationship, and then people going back and forth all the time. And so that was a regional celebration at the border states between the United States and Canada. And that is in June. And so that was a major celebration here in the city of Detroit. And it grew. And then the Freedom Festival took over. And this is an official celebration that's honored both by Windsor, the city of Windsor, which is in Ontario, and the city of Detroit, which is in Michigan, in the United States. As they created Freedom Festival, it subsumed and sucked all the air out of the old former Emancipation Day celebrations. And so they took a back seat, and there became first it was less of those until it was almost none. And so today in June, the end of June, in Michigan, in Detroit, there's the Freedom Day fireworks, Freedom Festival fireworks. There's a weekend of events going on at the riverfront, and then it ends with the fireworks. Same thing over in Windsor, across the river, in Canada. They have, yes, an International Freedom Festival. And so both of these are happening at the same time in this little talk about that former major celebration of Emancipation Day. And so what has happened in this place is the growth of Juneteenth.
Yes.
And so Juneteenth, which happens also in June, has become a major celebration throughout the country. And it was a major celebration before President Joe Biden made it signed it into law as a federal holiday. It had already become a major holiday. Now, of course, that helped to increase its popularity, but it was already the most popular emancipation celebration.
And June, it's so interesting that June is a month.
Yeah, and it's also important that
all the way along.
When June, that's right, when June 1833, when the Abolition Act is signed by Britain, which ends slavery in the British Empire or makes it illegal in the British Empire. 1833, that same year, that same year there's an uprising in the city of Detroit, June 17th. So Detroit has its own Juneteenth, really. There's an uprising in the city of Detroit. Two people, a husband and wife, have escaped from slavery in Louisville, Kentucky. They escaped in July of 1831. But in June of 1833, they've been captured here in the city of Detroit by slave catchers, along with the sheriff and deputy. They're being held in the Detroit jail, which was on Gratiot and Farmer. Today, that will be behind the CompuWare building or One Campus Marshes, right behind the former Hudson site.
Yes, yes.
It would be where the Skillman Public Library sits today.
Right.
That's where the jail was. So they're being held there. And a group of black people hold a meeting to plan how they're going to help their friends escape from slavery or escape from these slave catchers in the jail. One of the women at the meeting, Caroline French, will go and visit Lucy Blackburn. That is the woman who's being held in the jail who escaped from slavery. She'll go and visit her, and while in the jail cell, she'll switch clothes with Lucy Blackburn inside of the jail cell. When the sheriff comes to the jail cell and tells them that visiting time is over, this woman, Caroline French, stays in the jail cell wearing Lucy Blackburn's clothes. Lucy Blackburn walks out of the jail cell as if she's Caroline French. She's placed on a boat and crosses over to Canada, and she's free. This is June of 1833. Canada is ending slavery, or the law has been written to end slavery. She goes over to Canada, and the next day there's a 400 people outside to get Caroline out.
I was going to say, how did she get
to
out?
get her out,
Yeah.
and to get Thornton out.
Yes.
The sheriff is mortally wounded in this uprising. He won't die immediately, but he'll die later from injuries that he sustained that day. And Thornton will be freed, put on a boat, reunited with his wife, and they'll both be free. They'll move up to Toronto, and there will be a extradition request by the United States to send them back.
Really?
Because
come on in. Go ahead.
there'll be extradition requests to send them back because the sheriff was killed, and that's a felony. And so they asked Canada to send back Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, send them back, and the Canada basically has a legal precedent because this goes through the Canadian courts, and the Canadian courts ruled that they would never send someone back to face a penalty higher than they'd ever faced in Canada. Because now Canada doesn't have slavery. If Canada had slavery, this had happened 2 years prior, then Canada would have sent Thornton and Lucy back.
It really shows you how dynamic all of this is.
But since Canada doesn't have slavery, they won't send them back. Because we send them back, they'll be facing the penalty that we don't have in Canada, which is slavery.
Yeah.
So they become free, they move to Toronto, they start the first taxi company in the city of Toronto.
Wow.
They build 5 homes for other people who escaped from slavery,
Wow.
to have a place to live once they get free. The people who helped free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, they're the founders of Second Baptist Church, the
Wow.
oldest black church in the state of Michigan,
Yes.
which will become a station on the Underground Railroad, the first school for black people. It starts in the living room of the woman who switched clothes with Lucy Blackburn. That's where Second Baptist started, Caroline French's house,
Yeah.
before they had a building.
Right.
So all of this history is connected, and Detroit has a particular relationship with Juneteenth because it was June that really helped create the black community. That uprising forged relationships in the black community that will create institutions like Second Baptist Church, schools, the Colored Vigilant Committee, the Underground Railroad, the first black businesses. All of that is really formulated as a community because of this uprising to free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. So Detroit has that relationship. But of course, Juneteenth starts in Texas. Galveston, Texas is where General Gordon Granger came to notify the Confederates that they must let these black people be free. Black people knew they were free, but once the soldiers are there, they are now able to act on their freedom. And they begin celebrating it the next year, Juneteenth. And when the period of Reconstruction ends, so Reconstruction is a really short period, about from 1865 to 1876, so about a decade. But after Reconstruction is over and the Union troops are pulled from the South, the Confederate states begin to create Jim Crow and other black codes, racist laws to restrict the freedom of black people. And so they outlaw the celebration of Juneteenth in Texas, in Galveston, Texas. They outlaw it in public parks. So black people buy a park and continue celebrating Juneteenth because they like it, this is our park.
That's right.
You know, so we'll celebrate it. And then as they begin moving during the Great Migration, so people from Texas, some of them moved to Oklahoma and Arkansas. People who know about Juneteenth because they have family in Texas and then Louisiana, Alabama, when they move to Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, they bring Juneteenth with them. And so Juneteenth spreads throughout the country because of the Great Migration of African Americans. And Barbara Rose Collins, when she is a congresswoman, she will issue legislation or write legislation to make Juneteenth a national holiday.
I remember that.
It doesn't pass in Congress in her lifetime, or it does pass in her lifetime, but it doesn't pass while she's a congresswoman. And so, but she initiates that, and there are states throughout the country who one by one, Texas was first, but one by one make Juneteenth a state holiday. And of course, after the murder of George Floyd, so many states began practicing, and cities and towns began celebrating Juneteenth, that when Joe Biden became president and Kamala Harris was his vice president, they signed into law Juneteenth as a national federal holiday. And today it is the most popular holiday celebrating the end of slavery in this country. One of the reasons why it's so popular is because it is, the idea of it is to celebrate the freedom of all of us. While the other celebrations were the celebration of freedom of some of us, the black folks in Britain, they get freed under the Abolition Act by Great Britain. The black folks in Vermont get freed by the Constitution in Vermont. But these are freeing some of us. Wow, Juneteenth, the idea is that finally all of us are free.
Wow. This is what I mean by a public historian. Jamal, thank you so very